Okay. Ready? Okay, thanks. All right, so what if Petraeus was a hacker? Let's talk about email privacy for the rest of us. And I'm Phil Cryer, better known online as Faker. I consider myself an open source technologist, InfoSec researcher, and sometimes speaker, and privacy advocate. Now, last time I gave this talk, I covered some of the details at the end, and after going through so much stuff, I kind of want to, focus on things to think about during the talk as well as after. So, when I'm talking about email privacy, I want to talk about obviously the connection between you and your email service, which is standard HTTP process, but also security of the connection between mail servers when your mail is actually transferring over the internet using TLS. But also securing the content of your email, so that's like encrypting email before you send it. And of course, securing the storage of your email with disk encryption or other methods. So it's our privacy in email. Earlier this year, Woz had some interesting things to say about it, and basically pointed out that if you're mailing a letter, you have legal guarantees, but we don't have that with email. And so everything you send as email can be, viewable, and it's totally out there, unencrypted. He thinks the big companies and Google and Apple missed the opportunity by not including encryption, at least as an easier option to use in their clients. And then, so we look at mail, and we know that it's a violation of the federal law for anyone in the United States to open somebody else's mail. And in other countries, the constitutions guarantee more privacy than we have here. And they talk about controlling contents of one's mail or privacy is censorship and violates their civil rights. So let's look at some of the laws on email. Basically, in the U.S., there's really no constitutional guarantee on email privacy or correspondence just in general. There's the Fourth Amendment, but that gets down to a requirement of the reasonable expectation of privacy, which becomes kind of subjective. Email and other digital documents are protected by the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, and that was in 1986. And it's been criticized because there's not a lot of judicial review over demanding that consumers' information from internet providers. And of course, we know that email providers can, legally screen documents to display targeted advertising, for example. And if you're at a company and you're emailing, that email is actually property of the companies. And of course, we know more now that the government can do some sort of screening and with a perceived interest of national security on your mail. So we'll talk about the Petraeus incident. So we know the headlines. But what happened there? So David Petraeus, head of the CIA, working with Paula, who was doing a biography on his work in Afghanistan. Now, David and Paula were married to different people, but they still started a relationship that was inappropriate. Along came an old friend of David's, Jill, and she contacted David. Now, Paula didn't like this at all, so she saw Jill as a threat, so she started sending her threatening emails. And this was a problem because Jill immediately got the FBI involved, and everything went south pretty quickly there. Petraeus went to the White House, where he promptly resigned. And I think this is a really good example of collateral damage, taking a military phrase, because he really wasn't the target of this at all, but he got brought down by it. So kind of it displays a lot of the importance of looking at like metadata of users' email than versus just the contents.
And digging into it a little more, looking at how Petraeus was actually caught through all this. Rather than sending emails back and forth and making this email trail, they kind of logged into a shared Gmail account and just saved their emails in the drafts directory. Of course, the FBI was able to get subpoenas and IP addresses and able to tie the accounts back to Paula Broadwell. And from there, they could look at hotel records and Wi-Fi access and this kind of stuff to basically tie it back and point it all to her. And interesting, these kind of things didn't require any sort of judicial approval or a Fourth Amendment search warrant. Another thing with that, if the FBI was actually pursuing it as a counterintelligence inquiry rather than cyber stalking, that they'd have even more access to the data, even without a subpoena. Mark Rothenberg from Epic talks about basically the unexpected disclosures like this is just really common in computer-related cases because there's just so much data, it just becomes really open-ended. So, Edward Snowden gives PRISM information. And so what was PRISM? Well, some of the documents we learned, the scope and the reach of the government's program to try to basically look at communications that people are sharing. And we also learned that about some really scary graphic design. Snowden talks about how people can become targeted from emails they send or even like a Facebook profile. And once that happens, they get keycaps of the system's network. So they actually have the data. They can look at it, flag it if it's important, or really go through and screen it. He also said the NSA wants to get to the point where they can actually store all the metadata. And as we've seen, in a lot of cases, it's just more important than the content. XKeystore is a program they have that we learned about. Kind of just a front end for like different kind of database queries. They store things like chat, email, web browsing histories, and it makes it really easy for them to search through and pull up information on people. And one snippet we got in 2012, there's 41 million individual records collected in a month. And the emails get stored for 3 to 5 days, depending on if they're interesting. And if they're more interesting, they can be stored for up to 5 years. Snowden also pointed out that the U.S. is not the only country doing this, and that the so-called Five Eyes, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and the UK, really go beyond what the NSA is doing themselves. Bruce Schneider called in, and he points out that the NSA was collecting email and other data on activity of both Americans and foreigners. And that when the NSA were collecting this data, it was under a legal pretense, but when that changed, they basically changed the pretense. Meanwhile, FBI, the webmail providers, leave a lot of this wide open, as we talked about earlier, the unencrypted SMTP transfer of the email. It really leaves it wide open for the government or anybody to really read what you're talking about. Our researcher looked at how different large webmail providers deal with this. Google was the best, but they were all failing at some point. So all this private email is flowing through all these unencrypted links, making it really easy to snare or pull into databases. And we learned kind of more about this on the NSA talking about the upstream data collection, just the fiber cables that we know the UK were hacking into. And again, they could just access all that stuff and put it in a database and search it later to find out what they want to from it. So it's important to remember that this is a part of the Bush mandate early on, but it went in 2 years at least with Obama. But they still want to go after Mr. Snowden. For the NSA's part, they've had a lot of this before. We learned recently the Stellar Wind program, which whistleblower Bill Binney came up with in the past, has actually been confirmed now from some Freedom of Information docs that have come out. And again, it's interesting to think back when they were talking about, perceived spying, but they claimed it was all, for foreigners and people they were suspecting of terrorist activity. And again, the metadata can just tell you an awful lot. Who sends emails to whom, and IP addresses obviously can reveal locations, at least to a certain degree. Staying with the whole metadata idea, the MIT Media Lab had a program that was called Immersion that basically took your Gmail metadata and showed you what they could make of it. It was really cool. I mean, it came up with this weird interconnected map of people. And I ran through this. You have to give them permission to look at your metadata. I ran this, and it was just amazing, the cluster of people that got together. And then links between people that I didn't know knew each other. I mean, that happens online too, but I mean, just from my emails, I couldn't see that happening, but there it was. It's really bizarre. And the researchers really commented that they thought metadata was more important. It was more emotional, connections between people. The other thing with the NSA, they talk about encrypted or enciphered communications. Might be data they want to look at later. So even though most things they don't want to keep very long because they don't have the room for it, this is something that they can basically hold on to for as long as they like. Problem with that is, if they come across something that's illegal later, they can use that even though they didn't collect it for that purpose. It really goes against how it's supposed to be under the Constitution. So with all these disclosures, it's becoming clear that the government's really deliberately concealing a lot of its activities, and a lot of it is spying on innocent Americans. And it's really thanks to people like Thomas Drake and Bill Binney, Kurt Wiebe, and Edward Snowden that the public can really have this debate and bring up and question the government's motives. And those three were on a panel on the USA Today. It's actually a pretty interesting interview. It's a little brief, but good roundtable discussion. Covered a lot of things I didn't know. So the NSA is building a new data center in Utah. When this first came to light, information was actually taken from a Freedom of Information Act request. But it talks about the facility being a place that was committed to protecting the civil liberties of Americans and, of course, protecting the nation's cybersecurity. Of course, this was months before the leaks from Edward Snowden, so it was probably an easy sell back then. Groups that are actually supplying all the data and equipment think that this might be like, one of the largest reserves of data on the planet. Some are saying it might be as much as 5 zettabytes of data, which is a lot. For computing, they're using the Cray. And the XC30 series was actually financed by the Department of Defense. They're talking about maybe they could get speeds up to 100 petaflops, which is 1,000 trillion calculations a second. And of course, lately we've heard more about how they're looking at breaking different kinds of encryption. You can see definitely how this would be something they could use for that. Bruce comes in again with some comments, and he says this is all well and good, but these are just really guesses. We don't really know, and that it's really not the point. The point is that the government's really been on this secrecy binge, and it's just been overclassifying things like crazy. While I was researching this, I was reading a book. It's called This Machine Kills Secrets. It's a really good book. But it had some data that I found just really alarming when you look at the amount of documents that have been classified over the last 10 years and how much it's gone up. So 5 times the documents that are being classified versus not classified. And again, Bruce says that these things aren't being classified because they need to be secret, more that they'd be embarrassing for the country if it actually came out. The country's kind of putting their own self-interest before the people's. Now, I think privacy and anonymity online is a right, regardless of how you want to protect yourself or if you just want to stay silent. And the EFF's made some comments on this. They talk about the rights and protections that affords are just critically important for the success of the internet, and the free exchange of ideas is really driven because people are able to communicate anonymously. The Supreme Court's ruled that it's a freedom of speech option protected by the First Amendment. And so we'll look at some email tools and software. Of course, a lot of it was in the news recently. Pretty private email provider for the past 10 years. And basically put up this note that he was shutting down in order to protect his users, essentially. So we're not really sure what went on, but we know that he was probably being asked to turn over more information that he wanted to. And he's under a gag order, so he really can't say too much. But he's made the case that he recommends against anyone trusting their data to a company with physical ties in the U.S. And that afternoon, the same day that happened, that afternoon, Silent Circle, who basically gives different kind of global encryption options to use, shut down some of theirs. Silent Circle is run by Phil Zimmerman. He was the creator of PGP. And again, they had email, phone calls, text messages, video chat, but they closed down their email. And basically their email was the thing that wasn't really their product end-to-end, right? So the other things, they could fully control that it was secure end-to-end. With email, they just couldn't. They could secure it on their end and the next hop, but after that, they really couldn't. So in interviews, they pretty much said that this was kind of there because people wanted it, but they knew it really wasn't a great option. So other groups are looking at this. There's something called StartMail coming soon. This might have a chance because it's actually backed by the people that do IC-Quick, which is a really private search engine. And they talk about wanting to have an alternative versus all the big company provided web products. And they're basically talking about the culture of the free, where people are selling their personal data for free services, is really just really messing things up, the balance of power. So, and ultimately, it's a matter of if you want to pay with your data or actually pay for services. Other groups like Pirate Bay are looking at building an NSA-proof messenger app. We talk about, in this day and age, we really shouldn't be doing anything unencrypted, but you really have to look at different things, not just what company is dealing with it, but actually who runs the infrastructure and legally what jurisdiction they're in. So .com's Mega actually is getting into the mix too, and he wants to get messaging with fully encrypted email. And there's other things like purpose-built privacy tools. So Strongbox is something the New Yorker uses that makes it easier for sources to turn in data while staying anonymous. Essentially, they can only connect to it through Tor, and they get a certain ID where they can transfer requests, or messages back and forth, but still maintain their privacy. The software is built off of DeadDrop, and DeadDrop is pretty interesting because it was really the last project that Aaron Schwartz worked on before he died. Once again, a contact gets a unique code name, and there's a relationship established, but again, it's nothing that anyone can trace back to that user. So I've read articles on how Snowden could have stayed more anonymous, and I think this would just be the perfect tool because it's exactly what it was designed for. So we talk about companies having different privacy more focus on privacy in the laws than the US. So we looked at shipping email offshore. Well, it's not free. You're not paying with your data. One of the companies had an ad that I really liked. So I looked at a bunch of different, email privacy companies, all based offshore. And from there, I broke it down and kind of focused on some that I thought seemed extra promising. Now they all, protect your personal data and don't collect data that you don't consent to. And they don't store the info longer than they should. And just in general, they don't pass on or sell any information and offer different kinds of encryption. So Shinjiro, essentially it's a partner of Hushmail, but they're based out of Malaysia. So they have different encryption toolkits and messengers that people can use. MuteMail. Some of the technical details they go into, they offer non-standard SMTP ports. The IP address and host names are scrubbed from the email headers. And they don't keep any records or IP addresses associated with any of the emails. Trilite, kind of the same thing. They claim the IP is never visible. They have offshore SSH tunnels. And then they offer different payment options. These are kind of interesting because they kind of go away from kind of the big, Visa or MasterCard options. So that can give you more privacy as well. And in the community, they contribute a lot of articles online, some interesting stuff, and they also list their public key on their site. And last, Mailbox. Again, they have all sorts of IP anonymization. They offer unlimited disposable email addresses. And logs are kept, but it's only for performance analysis or abuse prevention, but the IPs are never tied to any of the logs. They offer some two-factor auth with a hardware token. And it's really interesting. They don't request any information or require any identifiable information from you when you actually sign up for an account. And of course, if you pay by check or credit card, that's going to kind of null that. But again, they actually offer other options. So you can pay through Bitcoin or other ways. That way you don't have to reveal any information when you sign up for their service. So those are some I came across. But if you go to the trouble of looking into that, make sure you look at other ways to pay. Maybe avoid some of the more common ones. Finally, look at kind of resources for improvement or ways to DIY, make it better yourself. Of course, there's plenty of resources out there to go and learn about it. EFF has a great self-defense primer. Great article on Freedom of Press Foundation. This was actually written by an EFF staffer. A lot of good information. Rise Up has a great page about it, and they actually offer email services that definitely focus on privacy before anything else. And just in other realms, there's the Crypto Party. Basically, just informal parties that go on around the world focusing on teaching each other encryption techniques. This is started by Asher Wolf, and if you don't follow her on Twitter, she's just a wealth of information on this. So there's this blog post about NSA proof your email in 2 hours. So pretty, headline that, tries to sell it. So I read about it, but it kind of just walks through, building your basic LAMP stack and building your own email server, which is great. But it really focuses on a lot of privacy-enhancing techniques in there. And this inspired these group of Ansible playbooks to be written about how to set up the system. And if you know anything about config management, Ansible playbooks are kind of like Chef or Puppet. Just think about it as like a bunch of scripts that go out and actually install and configure the system for you. So I've installed all this before, but keeping it up to date is kind of a pain, and this would actually make that really easy. And then a group called MailPile raised over $160,000 on their Indiegogo campaign recently. And now that they've done that, they want to, they're going to go and actually build this email client. It's kind of a front end that attempts to make privacy more a part of the client.
So this is really promising. I'm looking forward to trying this out, probably in concert with building the server as we talked about last slide. And a cool team of people. They're out in Iceland, but former Google people and just privacy advocates working there. All right, and as we talked about in the beginning, things to think about. So of course you want your email, to look at the security of the connection between you and your email service. But also more importantly, almost the security of the connection between email providers once your email leaves your server. You can look at securing content of your email with the PHP or PGP. And of course securing storage of email offshore, or actually building your own server. So we've learned a lot, especially over the past few months, what's going on. We kind of know what you're up against as far as privacy, and we know that privacy is not something that's really going to be built in. It's something you really have to add later and really think about how you're going to use it. And you can request privacy, but you really have to kind of go and do a lot of it yourself. So if you have any feedback, I'd love to hear back from you. My slides will be online soon. And I want to thank DerbyCon for having me speak, Snowden for really getting this conversation going, EFF for all they do, and SBS, the company I work for, that sends me to cool conferences like this. So thanks.